I'm Emily Yankee. I'm a professor in Peace and Conflict Studies, and I'm here today with Dr. David Campt, who's a dialogue and civic engagement expert. And I wanted to ask him just a few questions about himself and also his work in dialogue and building the dialogic capacity of communities and organizations and individuals. So a few
I'm happy
questions
to be
for you,
here.
David.
Great. Thanks so much for having me here.
So the first question I have is, why did you become engaged in dialogue work? What got the fire going?
I think it was growing up in Detroit. I grew up in Detroit in the late 60s, early 70s. It was a time of tremendous racial conflict. New black mayor, tremendous white flight. Detroit is the most racially segregated major city in the country. And I had a teacher, fourth grade teacher, Mr. Nathan Fine, who would always say, people are more alike than they are different. And it's important to remember that. And I think what he was doing was trying to keep the conflicts that were happening outside among adults from our fourth grade classroom. And that question of how similar are people or how different are people is in my mind. I have my father saying that we need to throw the mayor out and get a black mayor, and there were people much more militant than him about that. So that question of how to wrestle with people's differences was always on my mind. And my parents love each other. They're still alive, 62 years. And I would not say that the quality of their dialogue was very high. So I'm also seeing conflict at a personal level, at an intense level, not be resolved through skills of talking. And so I think that both seeing that at a macro level in my family made me always interested in the question of how not only how similar or different are people, but what is the role of effective conversation in trying to bridge those differences? And of course, you see conflict all around, and I think I've always had a peacemaker spirit in trying to figure out how to create better dialogue as a way of building community, feeling more connected, et cetera. But I think it goes back to little Davy in Mr. Fine's classroom and coming home to James and Geraldine.
I love it. That's great. Yeah, there's always that sort of that initial genesis story, I think, that has, when we dig deep, we see where our passion comes from.
Yeah.
So dialogue is a term that's often used synonymously with the term conversation, or we're talking, we're coming together, discussing, but you talk about dialogue in a different way, and you mean something different. Can you share a little bit about what you mean by dialogue?
Sure. I think one of the hallmarks of dialogue is the stance of the listeners, the stance of listening in the exchange. The best contrast is with debate. When a debate, each person is trying to see the flaws in the other person's perspective and look for holes in it and try to attack. And on some level, a lot of what's happening is people aren't really listening, they're just anticipating listening. Whereas in dialogue, I think the listening strategy is very different. What you're trying to do, instead of looking for what's wrong with the other person and their perspective, is to look for what's right about it. You're trying to dig beneath. You're trying to see where might be some commonality between me and that person. What can we agree on, even if we disagree about some other things? I think that stance of listening is the most important aspect of dialogue. But there are other things too. One of the things that people debate about is whether dialogue is attached to some action. There's differences of opinion. I tend to think that dialogue needs to have a kind of a dotted line relationship with action, because ultimately people look at things differently, and we're trying to probe what is that about. And if the focus is on we need to attack this problem, we need to do this, it's not clear whether we should do that together or not. That, in my view, dialogue needs to have action as a possibility, but not an inevitability. Now, in other kinds of exchanges, you want to do something. It can be an important conversation, an important debate even, but if you know that you're trying to get to an action that we have to do, it's probably not a dialogue. Dialogue is more exploratory in nature. And I think we don't have time for it. It's not well validated in our culture. We as peace builders need to promote that aggressively and to invite people to different ways of thinking, and maybe even different ways of using dialogue for problem solving. But I think that the core of dialogue is a kind of a listening to look for what might be valid in somebody else's perspective, including the possibility they have different experiences than I do.
So the key part of dialogue is also active listening.
Oh, yes. Well, just yes.
We
Active
usually
listening.
think of the speaking and the dialogue is I'm talking a lot, right? I'm sharing what I have, but the other side is maybe your ears are bigger than your mouth,
Right.
in terms of a listening strategy.
But right, and again, it's not just actively listening. You could argue that good debaters are actively listening in a certain way. They're attentively listening, but in a person listening from a stance of dialogue is listening for what might be true, and perhaps listening for what might be true that they didn't think about. It's an attitude of learning, an attitude of inquiry. It's an attitude of probing as opposed to attentive listening that is really still about attack. So it's from that stance of I really want to hear what you have to say because I might learn something from it. I might change my perspective about something. That I think is a core hallmark of dialogue. And so part of the challenge is not only promoting that is getting people to do that, but then figuring out how do you get people to a dialogic attitude, because that itself, since it's on some level uncommon, one could argue dialogue is a natural thing. You can make arguments about that. Part of what we have to figure out is how do we promote it from an attitudinal standpoint among participants, because their attitude is what makes it a dialogue.
Sure. So why is dialogue a toolkit that we should, or a tool that we should have in our metaphorical toolkit of things that we do as peace builders, conflict resolution managers, or mediators?
I think it was the Dalai Lama who, back in the 90s, said the 21st century will be the century of dialogue. I think he said that. And I think what he was in touch with was in an increasingly sort of fractured world where people have, in fact, very different experiences based on where they live, who they are, how much money they have, et cetera. But we have a common media that gives us goals that we share, jealousies that based on the fact that other people are achieving those that we might not be, and we have more critical decisions to be made. It is increasingly important that people be able to wrestle with their common problems by at first highlighting the way in which their experiences might be similar or different. I think that part of what we have to wrestle with as society, it's becoming more connected in some ways and more fractured in other ways. We need dialogue as a strategy to help people see the world around them in a more clear way so that we can come up with better collective solutions to the problems we commonly face that accommodate and adapt to the different perspectives that we have, different experiences, different ideas about what our experiences should be. Dialogue is an essential tool for us to engage in the sort of higher level group problem solving because people are coming from such different backgrounds. I mean, we can see that from the American political system where people are moving to places with people who have a similar ideology, which makes it more difficult, makes our politics more different, and makes it more difficult to have policy conversations for communities to wrestle with issues because we're so polarized. So given those tendencies, it is all the more important that people who are trying to keep society moving forward and knit together know about the tools of dialogue and spread them and spread the attitude of dialogic engagement of other people.
Right. Because often people think about dialogue as being about social justice and touchy-feely, and I think you make the case that no, this is also about more effective meetings, more effective decision-making, more civil discourse.
If we're going to craft solutions that don't have the backlash that some solutions create, that means we need to bring more voices into the process from the beginning. If we're going to do that, we can't presume we understand how those people look at the world, we understand their background, we understand their history, we understand their values. We don't. And so the reason that dialogue is so important is because it creates the possibility of seeing the other person clearly and starting out with their own experience, their own values, and me taking that in, not in a stance of judgment and listening for what's wrong, but from a stance of, oh, that's how you see it. Oh, that's how you see it. So given that, then we can ask, what might we do together on some problem we face together. I think what needs to be said is the core, I think, about what dialogue is you go from what's your experience, like you have people exchange experiences, and you tee that up in a way that there are different experiences around whatever topic you are on the table. So we're forgive the table metaphor.
Sure.
But they're in the
We'll still
pot.
use it
They're in the
anyway.
pot in the middle of the room.
Yes.
We've added to the pot. And so we see that diversity of experiences. And so the dialogue is then asking the question, why do we have different experiences? What is going on that we have such different experiences and or perspectives? And it's that act of probing beneath and asking why that I think is the core of the dialogic engagement. And so as we have discussed, for me, dialogue runs in a kind of a phased process where you first try to establish common intention, ground rules, et cetera, get a different experiences out in the middle of the table, probe beneath why might that be, and then ask the question, is there anything about that we might do? Make sure you've really thought through the different perspectives that people have about your questions. Both your experience questions, which I think experience questions need to precede perspective questions, whether you're talking about a polling sequence or a face-to-face dialogue.
Can you give an example of experience questions versus?
Oh, an experience question is, how did you think about the police when you were 10, and how is that different or the same than how you think about them right now? Right? That's an experience. Or what are experiences that drove, actually, what are your experiences that drove how you thought about police then and how you think about them now? So the point is that you want people's experiences on the table first, because I can think you're an idiot, but if you were actually strip searched when you were 11, then I can think you're an idiot for your attitude to police all you want. I can't deny your experience, or at least harder to deny it. So in my mind, making sure that you, one, highlight people's experiences first before you probe their perspective is a critical design challenge. But then that also means that you have to think through what are different ways, what are the questions you're going to raise and the diversity of answers you might get. And thinking that through is a critical task to practicing dialogue, whether it's small group, large group, or whatever. Think through how people different from you might answer a question and what might be the differences in a group that are productive. Because that's ultimately what you're trying to get at. You're trying to tee up questions where people do in fact answer them differently, and there's something interesting in that. That is your task. And so if you haven't scrubbed your design against that kind of lens, then you're not likely to really have a productive, empowering time, a time that is invigorating, which dialogue can be if it's designed well and executed well.
So was there a moment that there's sort of like that aha moment that either you had or you saw a participant have that sort of hooked you in this line of work, that's I'm going to keep doing it because that's the kind of reaction I want to get, whether it's and so we often talk about at scale, that a big decision was made, but I'm talking about that interpersonal, that personal level of somebody after a meeting or perhaps your own experience.
I think I have a couple of those that stand out in my mind. So one time I was doing facilitator training. I think it was in Camden, New Jersey, and this was the sponsoring group was they did a lot of racial reconciliation work, and so you will get people coming to that who have the reconciliation spirit, and you get people coming to that who have the we need to tell these white people how it is type of spirit, the more militant spirit, and that's fine as a participant. But if you're a facilitator, you have to have a different kind of attitude towards eliciting different people's points of view. And so this guy joined this facilitation training process, with this kind of militant stance, and we took him through the whole training process, and he said, "Oh, I get it now. This is something different. This is kind of like a surgery on people's souls. You're not just trying to manipulate them. You're really trying to work on them at a deep level." That was powerful. Another one was we did this polling thing. We were doing this thing about gentrification, and it was a midday meeting, and we asked people who how much money they made and et cetera. So it was a meeting on gentrification, 3-hour meeting, middle of the day, and we asked the polling question about the question of how much money they made, and 40% of the people made over $100,000. It was a very well-heeled group, right? And so after we showed that, this one woman said, this question shows I have a prejudice. I would never have thought in the world that you people, these rich people, I'm one of the people who make less than $25,000. I would never have thought that you rich people would come to a meeting like this. You guys, I don't think of you as caring about the community. So I have to look at my own prejudice about that. And I got to think about, why do I have that, and who do I want to work with? And I think that experience that's kind of an insight, like, oh, people see themselves differently. And that's good.